About 1 in 5 Americans display signs of a mental illness or crisis. That's according to national research. And here on the First Coast, access to care can be difficult to find when there's an emergency or between regular checkups. But tonight, as On Your Side's Alex Osiris explains, there's new funding and new opportunities to help.
Reaching those in need faster, the catch-all net for behavioral health patients that's aiming to make a difference.
If they are feeling distressed and they need to talk to somebody quickly, they can be seen quickly.
Changing how things work, a focus on getting resources deployed faster and more consistently. The work at Baptist and Wolfson Children's, where they'll see a wide age range of patients, using video teleconferencing to check in or be there whenever patients experience a crisis or have a question.
If we correlate physical health to mental health, if you're not feeling well, if you're experiencing flu symptoms, you're going to want to be seen rather quickly. We need to treat behavioral health the same way. Florida,
which ranks near the bottom of states in terms of how much it spends on mental health per person, could see more funding in this year's state budget. $100 million for mental health counseling in schools among one of the proposals. Andrew says locally there's a need, but with the new clinic and cooperation, she's hoping that changes.
We do need more providers. We do need more therapists and counselors and psychiatrists and nurse practitioners to be able to provide mental health services, and also quickly and timely.
The clinic expects to expand its services in the late summer and into the fall. Reporting, Alex Osiris, First Coast News, On Your Side.